Hey folks, Antonio Arellano here. Welcome to a conversation with Matthew Dowd, Democratic candidate for Texas Lieutenant Governor. Texas is on the tip of the tongue of everybody across the country, and this race is one of the most important ones, not just statewide, but nationally, because the Lieutenant Governor of Texas is arguably the most powerful position in the state. Matthew Dowd is ready to transform Texas and has a new vision for the state. Let's learn a little bit about this candidate.
For the nearly 40 years I have lived here in Texas, I've raised 3 sons and a daughter, and buried a son and daughter far too young in Texas soil. For their sake, and for all Texans, I'm angry. The GOP politicians have failed us, especially the cruel and craven Lieutenant Governor. Dan Patrick has been lying and deceiving, fracturing the bonds we share and endangering all our lives. He does not believe in the common good. He seeks only to represent himself and the 5% of the state that goes along with all this. He puts his me over our we. With COVID-19 taking thousands of Texans' lives, Dan Patrick didn't respond to it based on science and prevented local officials from doing the things they needed to do to keep their communities safe. And in the aftermath of mass shootings in Texas, he pushed through a bill to make it easier for people to openly carry handguns without a permit or training. And when the electric grid failed here in Texas, he didn't protect us. He shifted the burden of fixing the system on each of us. And with healthcare costs out of control, the Texas Lieutenant Governor waged a culture war, decimating Roe versus Wade and attacking the diversity of our state. And after more Texans voted than ever before, in the most secure election in our history, the Lieutenant Governor attacked voting rights and has made it harder for all Texans to vote. Enough is enough.
Enough is enough. Matthew, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Antonio. Thank you for having me, man.
Absolutely. How's Wimberley?
It's awesome. You know, it's the hill country. It's beautiful, and the people are great. And I've enjoyed having the headquarters here in this great town. So, yeah, I love it here.
Fantastic. Well, you've launched this campaign for Lieutenant Governor, and it's got a lot of attention. Let's dive right on in and talk about one of the issues that's percolating nationally coming out of Texas, and that's voter suppression. We saw that as a result of the 2020 historic voter turnout, a crackdown on voter participation, and the legislator codified it as election integrity. Tell me a little bit about what your take and your perspective is on all of this voter suppression conversations happening right now.
Well, Antonio, I'm glad you started there, because to me, this is the most important part of the entire conversation we need to have. And it's the actually opposite of integrity. Dan Patrick is very consistent on all the issues. And this is a perfect example of how consistent he is. When an issue faces us, he lies, deceives, and then he does something that makes it worse. In this case, we had the most, as you said, the biggest turnout we've ever had in our history in Texas, largest turnout we've ever had, in the most secure election that we've ever had, fewest problems, fewest voter fraud, fewest of any of that. And what is the Lieutenant Governor's response? First, he pushes the big lie that there was widespread voter fraud. Totally not true. He sort of adopted what Donald Trump had said, and he did it in his own way. And then what he does in the aftermath of an historic turnout and a secure election, he makes it harder for people to vote, and all people to vote. And to me, this is the biggest problem, because all the other issues, while important, we can't do anything about it unless we as voters and as people that are subject to elected officials and what they do don't have ability to hold them accountable. And that's what the vote is. We don't have, the money to hire lobbyists. We don't have the money to make huge contributions, but we do have the ability to vote. And it's our one thing in the system that allows us to reward somebody that does a good job or fire somebody that does a bad job. And in this case, I think Dan Patrick and the rest of the GOP knows full well all of the things that they've done have been highly out of sync with the majority of Texans. But what they want to do is create a situation where it's harder for people to hold them accountable. And this is the most fundamental thing that I think we're going to actually fight over.
Well, I understand that the current lieutenant governor probably wants to keep the electorate small because it's easier to control and it's better for him to stay in power. But what we're seeing here is a election integrity voter suppression codified that targets folks with language barriers, targets folks with disabilities, bans 24-hour drive-through voting, and emboldens poll watchers to target folks that are politically motivated. It's important also to note, Matthew, that there is no wide voter suppression. I'm sorry, there's no wide voter fraud happening in Texas. Isn't that right?
No, that's exactly right. They spent the cruel lieutenant governor and the crook that we have as attorney general spent millions and millions and millions of dollars and found 16 people out of 11 million people that they think either made a mistake or committed some act. 16, not 1.6 million or 16,000, 16 people out of this whole thing. And I think it fundamentally goes to, I think the Republicans know, and just like the Democrats know, us Democrats know, that the state has changed in fundamental ways in diversity. And what they want to do is, one, they know their policies, and we'll get into more of them, are highly unpopular, but they also know that if the electorate on election day in November looked like what the population of the state does, the diversity of the state, they would lose. And so they do everything in their means to change that. And I'll give you all one stat. Texas ranks 50th, not 15th, not 5th, 50th in ease of voting. After Alabama, after Mississippi, after Arkansas, we are dead last in ease of voting. In the 90s, when I worked and ran the lieutenant governor, the last Democrat to hold this office, and I ran his campaign and worked for him for 8 years, we ranked 14th. So we've fallen 36 places in the 20 years that the Republicans have been in power here, and they're doing their best so that the people that show up to vote don't match what the state actually looks like.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I see a comment coming in here from Teresa. It says, it's a solution in search of a problem. Voter fraud is not running rampant in Texas. You're absolutely right, Teresa. And that's why we need to make sure that we change the leadership in the state so that we have a representative democracy. And Matthew, you also talked about the demographic shift that Texas is undergoing and how that threatens those who are currently in power, who have been targeting communities of color disproportionately. Let's talk about some of the issues we can tackle to resolve this. I support automatic voter registration, online voter registration, and Texas is one of the only states that doesn't offer that to its constituencies. As Lieutenant Governor, Matthew, would you move forward automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, and online voter registration, or what are your policy changes?
So absolutely. Absolutely. The day I get in there, I would push that. Absolutely. I think we should do whatever we possibly can do that both keeps a secure election, but makes it easier for people to vote. It shouldn't be easier for people to do all these other things in life. People can sit there at their home and buy a house online on the DocuSign, but we make it so difficult for people to vote. And to me, everything else, while all of the other issues are important, the grid, choice, education, jobs, all of those are important, they cannot happen, and we cannot express our voice unless people are represented at the voting booth in that. And so absolutely 100%, we should have same day online registration. Absolutely. It would make it so much easier, and it would eliminate a barrier that Texas is one of the few states, as you said, puts in place to make it harder for people to vote.
Well, there you have it, folks. Matthew Dowd saying priority for him to make voter access available to all Texans. Let's talk about what we would do to re-engage those who are going to be disenfranchised by this new election integrity policy. How would you course correct the actions that have already been taken?
So I think the first thing we have to do is we can't correct this unless we overcome these impediments. And so there are impediments. I wish they didn't exist. I wish the lieutenant governor and the governor hadn't done these things. They did it. They made it harder. And so we're going to have to work even harder to overcome the impediments. It's the only way to course correct and fix the problem and fix all of the other harmful things the lieutenant governor has done. He's hurt every single day. He's done policies that have hurt Texas families every single day in this state. And so the first thing we have to do, and it's incumbent upon us, And people before us have done this who faced greater impediments back in the 60s, back in the 50s, back in the 40s, who overcome. We're going to have to honor their legacy. All the people that came before us that overcame impediments to vote and to engage civically in this, we're going to have to do that. And the only way we can return or get back to or reform the policies is we have to win these elections. And the only way we can do that is overcome the impediments that exist.
It seems folks have forgotten that access to democracy is a Texas issue. I mean, it was LBJ who helped create greater access for democracy in America. And we need that type of bold, fearless leadership back in Texas. Let me transition now, Matthew. In light of today's Supreme Court hearing on the abortion ban in Texas, if the court decides to uphold the law, what steps would you take as Lieutenant Governor to make sure that women have the right to choose?
So first, this is an issue that's fundamental to the Constitution, has been in place for 50 years, was determined to be a constitutional right, which had the basis of it, the right of privacy. We got to throw this law out as quickly as we can. If I'm elected Lieutenant Governor and we have the ability and the votes, we should get rid of this. This is basically a ban or getting rid of Roe versus Wade. It's not adding an exemption. It's getting rid of Roe versus Wade. I understand completely people of faith and struggle with this, but in the end, and I'm a person of faith, it's very important to me, but in the end, while you might read the Bible by your bedside or at home or all those things and practice faith or go to church every Sunday or whatever you might do, in my view, what ought to rule at the Capitol is not the Bible, but the Constitution of the United States of America. And one thing that I fear that if this is allowed to stand is at the basis of this, as I said, is the right of privacy. And once you erode this right, which is Roe versus Wade and the right freedom of women to decide their own healthcare choices, it becomes much easier to erode the other rights that are based on privacy, like the right that people have to be in whatever relationship they want, like the right of marriage, like the right of search and seizure. All of those fundamental rights in our Constitution are based in the right of privacy. And if they can throw one out, which they're trying to do, and they did here in Texas, and trying to overdo it at the Supreme Court, if that can happen, then all of those other things can follow, because the right of privacy is at the basis of all of those things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mean, deputizing civilians to enforce the law, putting a bounty on Texans' heads, this is really draconian policies, Matthew. How would you make sure that we are putting Texas into a new light?
Well, first of all, I think we have to stand up. We have to have each other's backs. And I think this is important on all of us. And people say, well, this is a woman's issue. And, I know they're upset, but we as men or whatever way we are, we have to go out of our way to stand up for other people and to get their backs, to have their backs in this. Because as I said, you take away this right, it puts people's health in peril. It puts women's health in peril. It takes away a fundamental right that they have, a fundamental choice that they have. If they don't have the right over their own body, then they really basically don't have any other rights in the course of this. And so I think as all Democrats, and there's so many different issues. I mean, people say, well, I don't have any problem voting. Then, I'm not going to worry about X, Y, and Z that's living wherever. As I said, we as people that believe in the common good and a sense of common decency need to have each other's backs regardless of the issue.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up in terms of men standing up and also having the backs of their sisters, their mothers, and their friends and family. It's important that we are all speaking about this issue. And of course, women leading on the issue, but making sure that we're echoing and advocating on their behalf. And as someone who's seeking the Lieutenant Governor position, it's imperative that we have action behind those words as well. Let me move forward, Matthew. Let's talk about permitless carry law. So Texas has a new law that went into effect on September 1st that allows people without training or without permits to just carry their guns freely throughout the state. Some law enforcement officers have expressed concern that this makes their job even more dangerous. How do you see this play out?
Well, this is another issue that it's amazing what the Lieutenant Governor did. And it's a perfect another example of what I said about his consistency. So Texas has more mass shootings in the last 10 years than any other state. Last year, 3,500 people died of gun violence. For everybody listening, either every 2 or 3 days, we hear about some other gun violence that occurred either at a school or somewhere else that has occurred in here. What's the lieutenant governor's response to that? First, he lies and says anybody that opposes any common sense gun reform is against the Second Amendment. I'm a gun owner. I own rifles and shotguns. I've hunted in my life. I'm a believer in the Second Amendment. But I also believe there ought to be common sense gun reform. And it ought to be something that most Texans support, which there's 3 things that a vast majority of Texans support here. We ought to not be making it easier for people to carry around a handgun without, as you say, without a permit or a license. It's amazing. In the wake of all this gun violence, he makes it easier for people to become the victim of gun violence. But I believe in 3 things that we ought to do right away. First, universal background checks. 40% of the guns that are sold in Texas do not go through the federally required background check. 40% of the guns sold here because of the loopholes in the law. So we need universal background checks, close the loopholes. Second, roll back this crazy permitless carry bill that was done. Even when you talk to most Republicans even disagree with this and say it's crazy that we did this in the aftermath of so much gun violence. And the third thing is we should have red flag laws in Texas. Most other states have it. And red flag laws, for everybody that doesn't know, are the thing where if somebody is off or somebody is a danger to themselves or people in their house, either they have a history of abuse or they're mentally off or something, there's some other concern, somebody can petition a judge to remove temporarily the gun from their house. Seems to be common sense and seems to protect the common good. As I've talked about, our campaign is about common sense, common decency, and the common good. All 3 of those apply here. All 3 of those, as I said, all 3 of those changes in common sense gun laws are supported by the vast majority of Texans, and the vast majority of gun owners also agree with that.
You know what, Matthew, one thing that really upsets me as a Latino in Texas is the fact that we saw what happened in El Paso, the worst massacre of Mexican Americans and Hispanics in American history at that Walmart. And on the heels of this horrible tragedy is that we pass more access to guns, promoting almost senseless violence. And these words came out of the lieutenant governor's mouth. How do you respond?
So I was just going to say, this is so outrageous and so despicable. The lieutenant governor of Texas, after that mass shooting and after they had the manifesto of the nut and crazy person that shot all the people at the Walmart in El Paso, repeats almost the exact same words, almost to a letter, the exact same words of the people, of the guy that shot the people in El Paso. He's talked about an invasion and all of that. And what is the most upsetting is not only changes in gun laws and refusing to do anything about gun violence as children suffer and parents suffer and people suffer and killed at churches and killed at Walmarts and killed at restaurants. Even outside of all that, his language creates an environment where gun law, not only does he change the gun laws and make it easier, but he uses language that creates an environment where violence is more likely to occur. And in my view, that many of the people that have died in the course of this, we should put right at his responsibility, the responsibility of the lieutenant governor and the responsibility of the governor for not having done a single thing about it and made it worse. Because one of the most fundamental jobs of the people that lead us are to protect us. And they're doing nothing to protect us from gun violence.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's keep it on that in that breath, and let's transition to school gun violence and the massacres that we've seen. And unfortunately, Texas has not has had its own fair share of school violence. As Lieutenant Governor, how would you address gun violence at schools and gun violence safety overall?
So as I said, I'm a believer that you can be a person that owns guns and believe in the Second Amendment, but also do the things that you need to do to protect people. And as I said, those 3 things, universal background checks will help. Red flag laws will help. Rolling back the permitless carry will help. I also believe, and the lieutenant governor has done this in other issues, but he has taken away the power of schools to protect our students and to teach their students. He and the governor are going out of their way to take the power from the local districts and teachers and administrators to teach their kids history, to teach their kids science, and to protect their students, whether it's from guns or whether it's from a pandemic. All of those things have been done in concert, whereas you remove power and the ability of an administrator, ability of teachers to do what they need to do to protect their students and teach their students. We need to return to a time where teachers and administrators have the power and authority to protect their students in all the different ways they need to be protected, and to teach their students what is history in our state and what is history of the country, and not take that power away from our school districts.
You're absolutely right, and we need that type of leadership in this state, like you mentioned, that is ready to protect, not put folks in jeopardy, and continuing to spout out discriminatory and often racist rhetoric. Speaking of which, earlier on in the pandemic, both the governor and lieutenant governor blamed COVID increased numbers in Texas to immigrants.
Yep.
And the lieutenant governor went as far as to say, after the Delta spike, that Black Texans were to blame. Your response?
And then add to that, Antonio, add to that the fact that he basically encouraged old people to die because he thought that would help the economy. So he went after as many groups as he possibly could do, and never actually told the truth, and never actually related to the science of this. COVID is another example of all of this, of his deception, and then putting in place in policies and words that have actually hurt more Texans. 70,000 plus Texans have died from COVID in 18 months. 70,000. More Texans have died from COVID in the 18 months than died in every war, than Texans who died in every war since the Civil War. Add up all the wars since the Civil War and Texans that died in that, more people died from COVID. Many of those died unnecessarily because of the policies that were put in place and the words used and the pushback by the lieutenant governor and the things he said and did. One of the things he did related to the school districts is they put in place policies that forbid cities and counties from protecting their own citizens, from putting in place protocols that they could protect their own citizens in the midst of this pandemic. It's unbelievable to me. It used to be a pillar of the Republican Party and their conservative movement that local control and local ability was where the decisions would need to be made. They have taken most of that power away from cities and counties around the state and prevented, as I said, prevented these elected officials who are most closest to the problem from doing what's necessary to protect their citizens in the midst of a grave pandemic.
Yeah, and let's continue on this pandemic, and let's talk about solutions-oriented results. If you are elected the next lieutenant governor of Texas, how would you course correct or manage the pandemic if we're still in that situation?
So one of the primary things, and I learned this when I worked for Bob Bullock, who's the last Democrat lieutenant governor, one of the things I learned is that you can welcome all ideas and welcome all thought. But in my view, and anybody can come in, doesn't matter if they had a red jersey on or a purple jersey or a green jersey, but they have to agree to three things. And the pandemic is a perfect example of this. First, they have to agree that their policies are going to be put in place that will help all Texans, not just a particular interest group and a particular group or a particular special interest. It's going to help all Texans, whatever the policies are. Two, that your policies are in the interest of the common good, that they're interested in the common good, like vaccinations, like masking. They're all in the interest of the common good. And three, you have to base your policies on science, data, and the truth. Science, data, and the truth. And if you can come in and have those three things in mind, let's gather around the table. There's smarter people than me in the medical field and the health field and science field that should give advice and thought on it. But you have to come in. Doesn't matter if you were Republican, Independent, or Democrat. It doesn't matter to me. If you agree to those three things, let's figure out a policy based on science and based what's in the common good of the state of Texas.
We've seen some pretty heated debate at school boards across the state and across the country in terms of mask mandates at schools. What's your position?
I think schools ought to be able to decide what's in their best interest. I'm a believer in mask mandates, especially in the midst of a grave pandemic. I'm a believer that people should get vaccinated, that we should have vaccination requirements. We required in schools for many other things that all of my kids had to go through vaccinations in order to enter into the public school system. And so I think, and it ought to be based on the science, and masks have been proven to work and slow the spread and keep people from getting sick. Vaccinations the same way. And so it ought to be all based on science and what the greatest smartest minds in the health industry. And if in the moment we need, because it's spreading, we need masks, then they should be mandated. There should be no question about that.
There's nothing wrong with protecting the lives of our children. I think it's imperative that folks start to have a common sense approach to masking and recognize that this is just one step closer to safety and to normality. And I think that we should continue to promote that.
It's also, Antonio, to add to that, it should be common sense. And I was brought up, and I know you were brought up with the idea that we don't just make decisions that for ourselves, we make decisions that are for everyone else, right? And so I can't drink and drive. That's against the law, right? I can't drink and drive, even though, quote unquote, I should have the freedom, as many people say. We should be acting in the interest of everybody. If a simple thing as a piece of cloth will protect people, we should do it.
That's right. Moving on, in terms of, as a fellow Texan who experienced the February freeze, let's talk about the power grid. So I've yet to see any accountability for what happened and really the lives lost in the state because of this massive failure. It was public knowledge that the winterization suggestions were made prior to the freeze, but were not acted upon. As Lieutenant Governor, what would you do to make sure that our infrastructure is ready to prevent anything like that from happening again?
Like so many of these other things we talked about, the first thing you have to do is tell the truth, hold people accountable, and do what's in the common good of people. And the decent thing to do, which is take care of fellow Texans, should be a government responsibility in this. I lost water and power myself here in Wimberley for 8 days. I was without water and power for 8 days. I had to move down to New Braunfels into a hotel until the hotel lost water and power. And then I moved into a room in the garage of the mayor of Wimberley, because her temperature was actually above 50. So I experienced this not as bad as others did. We lost 700 people. 700 people died. Millions were without power and water, and thousands of businesses went out of business. Some have not come back from that. And what happened in that time? It was the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of our state in 8 days. $6 billion was transferred from ratepayers like you and me and the people listening to a few energy companies. In 8 days, $6 billion was transferred. And what was the response by the Lieutenant Governor? It wasn't to hold them accountable. It wasn't they didn't mandate weatherization. And as you said, 10 years ago, they were told to do this. They needed to do this. They didn't do it. And even in the aftermath of what happened last February in the big freeze, they didn't mandate it. So now these companies don't have to do it. The only thing they did in the legislature was to make it easier to charge us more on our utility bills. That's what they did. They made it easier to charge us more. And so when people's bills go up in the cold of this winter or the heat of the summer, it's directly related to that legislation. What I think we should do is first mandate weatherizations that are paid for by those companies that made all the money. That's who ought to pay for it. We ought to not be paying for the weatherization they should have done 10 years ago. And second, we should hold, in my view, either civilly or criminally liable the people that knew about this that didn't do it. Because people died, people suffered, businesses went under, and we're still recovering from this. And my fear is we're going to go through this again because people did not take the responsibility, and our elected leaders fell down on the job and failed us in this. And so that is my view of what needs to happen. One, pass the law, mandate it, they pay for it. And two, somebody, whoever's involved and didn't make the decision, should be held civilly or criminally liable for this.
It's absolutely an undeniable failure of the government. And I mean, to not be able to keep the lights on, to keep the power going in Texas is something that definitely should have a response from the voters in November coming up next year. Climate change. Right. So this is part of what we're dealing with here in Texas. It's no stranger to massive hurricanes and now incredible freezes. How do you address climate change and position Texas as a climate justice leader?
So this is one of these ones where Texas should be the number one state in dealing with this issue in clean energy. We've created a lot of jobs, thousands of jobs in various industries related to clean energy. We haven't done as much as we could, even though businesses have been doing it, because we have put clean energy at a disadvantage to the oil and gas industry. I'm a believer in the importance of the oil and gas industry. I'm a believer in it. A lot of people in Texas are employed in it. Average working class people are pipe fitters and all of the other jobs they do. It's an important part of Texas. But the first thing we have to acknowledge to get to the fix is that climate change is real and it's having hugely detrimental effects. It's causing more flooding. It's causing hotter summers, colder winters. It's causing more hurricanes and harsher hurricanes. And we are a central point of where this is happening. And we have resources that are limited in what we can do and what we have on this and how we go forward. So to me, the first thing we have to do is another example of accept the science, climate change is real, and then figure out the policies to put in place to at least get the clean energy industry. Don't even have to give them advantages over the oil and gas industry. Give them the same advantages the oil and gas industry has here, and let them compete. Let them compete, because my bet is, because the future is where clean energy is, the clean energy will win that competition. And I know from having talked to many people in the oil and gas industry, most of them understand that they're going to have to transition to a more cleaner energy environment in where we are. And so the first thing is, acknowledge the oil and gas industry in Texas is exceedingly important in all parts of the state. It is and will be for a while. But two, we have to admit and agree that the science says climate change is real, and there is a number of things that we can do in concert with both of those two things that we admit. But I think one of the main things we do is give the clean energy industry an even playing field with the oil and gas industry.
You're absolutely right. And you know who else gets it? Young voters. Young voters in Texas are listening closely to how their candidates are speaking about climate change and making decisions based on that, because they recognize that Texas can be an energy leader in terms of renewable energy, solar energy, wind energy. We have an opportunity here to really boost the economic impact in Texas, and it's a no-brainer to move steadily in that direction.
And we have the people here, the talent here. We have our natural resources. We have everything here to be the dominant state in clean energy. We can be the dominant state, and we are almost at the point where the number of clean energy jobs in Texas equals the number of oil and gas jobs. We're almost at the point where those two are equal right now. But Texas could be the leader on this if it just follows the science. We do not have elected officials, either lieutenant governor or the governor. We do not have elected officials that admit climate change is real. And like any problem, as you know, Antonio, the first thing you have to do is you have to admit it. You have to admit you have a problem. They won't even admit there's a problem.
One of the biggest constituencies in Texas is the Latino voter, and the demographic shift that Texas is undergoing, according to the census, showcases that the population growth is being led by Hispanic population. Recently, Dan Patrick, the current lieutenant governor, went on Fox News and said this about the Latino vote in the Valley.
What's going to happen in the Rio Grande Valley? That Rio Grande Valley that Trump turned 7 counties for the first time ever from Democrat to Republican, he's going to, not he, but in the 22 elections, when all of us are up, Governor Abbott, myself, the statewides, and congressmen, we're going to turn that whole valley Republican. Hispanics across this country that we've always said share our values, pro-life, for charter schools, lower taxes, economic opportunity, Second Amendment rights, and border security. Hispanics in this country are going to be, I think, the leaders to throw the Democrats out on the rear end for good.
He seems pretty confident that he's going to win the Rio Grande Valley. What is your campaign doing to reach out to Latinos?
So I actually think that, I don't believe 90% of what he says, and some of the things he says about where Latinos are on certain issues, he's completely wrong about, but that's okay. The Latino community, to me, is probably going to be the determinative political group of where Texas goes and where ultimately the nation goes. To me, as Texas goes, the nation will go. So if Texas begins to turn blue or purple and become the nation, will move in that direction. So to me, Texas is the central point of all these issues, and the central point in Texas is the Latinos or Hispanics in this state. That is the most crucial part of this. They are right that they have made inroads. The Republicans have made inroads about this. I think it's more because of a lack of work and effort and right messaging that Democrats have done in there. I think for too long, Democratic candidates, especially statewide candidates, have taken for granted Latinos and Hispanics in the state. I think they've treated them like they're get out the vote voters and not like they're key swing voters that they need to talk to for more than just 3 weeks or a month or 5 weeks or whatever it is. We have to have a conversation with them on a regular basis outside of election time. I'm driving down my truck down to the Rio Grande Valley tomorrow. I'm going to be in Hidalgo County, Cameron County, and Nueces County over the next 3 days because I know how important this is. To me, this election in 2022, there's many groups that are important, no doubt about that. Many different groups, Asian Americans, African Americans, and different groups of suburban whites, all that's important. But to me, the most important group right now are the Hispanic voters in the state. And if Republicans do what Dan Patrick says, and we allow that as Democrats, and we have to stop taking Latinos and Hispanics for granted and start treating them like they're a swing voter group that we can't just call up the day before election day and tell to go vote. We have to have an engagement with them and a conversation with them that lasts longer than 2 minutes on the phone.
Let me tell you, as a Latino in Texas, I can confirm that Latinos are ideologically, linguistically, and culturally diverse. And the Democratic Party and the Republican Party need to stop treating Latinos as a given entity and treat them as a constituency that demands recruitment, that demands investment, that demands engagement. And that's how you mobilize the Latino constituency. Really quick, before I let you go, Latinos are the most uninsured people in Texas. Do you support Medicaid expansion?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, why? I mean, it's ridiculous that we don't have it. It doesn't cost us anything. It's basically you pay a tax dollar and we get our tax dollar back in reimbursement from the federal government. So it doesn't cost us anything. 2, we're the largest uninsured state. We have the most uninsured people in the country, most uninsured. We're number 1 in all the bad stuff, and we're number 50th or 49th in all the stuff we should be number 1 in here. But the other thing is 1, it doesn't cost us much. It doesn't cost us anything. 2, it provides access to people's health and they're able to go to school and their people's health and all to live better. But 3, it actually lowers the cost of overall private insurance because when you have more people in a bargaining group in Medicaid, it basically provides an incentive to lower all the healthcare costs. So even somebody that has private insurance should want this because it's going to lower their cost when we implement this. And finally, it's going to create 200,000 jobs. It'll create 200,000 jobs. So it's a job creator. It doesn't cost us anything, and it'll lower the cost of healthcare. Why shouldn't we do it?
You're absolutely right. The race to the midterms is in full effect here in Texas. Thank you so much for your time today, Matthew Dowd, candidate for Texas Lieutenant Governor. And quick reminder to all our folks tuning in from Texas, tomorrow's election day. You don't have to wait until November 2022. You can vote on the election that's happening tomorrow as well. So make sure that you do go and cast a ballot, get engaged, and stay engaged. Thank you so much.